Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us once again this week. I'm here with Pastor Cady. He is the pastor of Whitefields Community Church here in Longmont, Colorado. And we are back in our series called The Risen Life as we look at, what did you call it, the period after towards Pentecost, from Easter to Pentecost?
Eastertide.
Eastertide. And we look at the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, and it's just been a great study. And we found ourselves this week looking at Thomas as Jesus appears to Thomas and says, put your hands in my wounds and, let your disbelief go to belief. And Thomas says, my Lord and my God. And so we looked at a few of those things and some interesting facts about Thomas, just to go on. Thomas is it's reported that he died in India, but there's a lot of evidence and a lot of records point to the fact he might have gone all the way into China as well. So that's just very, very interesting when you think about where Thomas went after this point in going from doubt to belief, becomes a missionary out towards the east. And so that was the title of our message, From Doubt to Belief, and you can find it there at whitefieldscommunitychurch.com. If you missed our sermon on Sunday, and it's of course on any of your favorite streaming platforms, and if you would please like or review, rate it, 5-star rating if possible. Leave a comment. That always really, really helps in the algorithm and getting this content out there so that when people are asking, things about God, about life, we can give them Christ-centered, gospel-centered answers to their questions. And of course, it's up on YouTube. It's up on Facebook. Definitely follow us there, subscribe, and like, and do all those kind of things. But this week's sermon in John chapter 20, we looked at, that interaction there with Jesus and Thomas, and we had a lot of feedback about people were really, kind of touched, or it really impacted them, this idea of having doubts about your faith.
Yeah, I think that, I mentioned that there's a couple different ways that people respond to doubt. One way is to demonize it. I think that that's been done a lot. I've seen it, where people are like, hey, just believe, man. Like, hey, stop asking so many questions, and that's not helpful, because what happens is with anything you suppress, right, it doesn't go away. And so the other way is to idolize doubt. I think that's really common, especially with people my age and younger. It's really popular now to deconstruct. But if you deconstruct and you never get anywhere, then what was the point of that, right? I think there's a really interesting quote from The Life of Pi, which is a book kind of like, it's a novel, but it used a lot of philosophy and stuff. And it says that choosing doubt as a philosophy of life is like choosing immobility as a means of transportation. What's the point? It doesn't get you anywhere. And so rather than that, we want to see doubt as an opportunity. And I think that we can see that in the Bible, that Jesus is very patient with people who doubt. God is patient in the Old Testament with people who doubted, like Gideon, gives him so much grace and patience beyond what he deserved. And isn't that true for all of us? But I would say that the one thing I would want people to know, and I think the reason it resonated, is because on the one hand, everybody has struggled with doubt. As I said, doubt is part of faith. You can't have faith unless there's some degree of something you don't know, right? And so that's what takes faith. That's where trust begins. And so rather than demonizing doubt, and rather than idolizing doubt, we want to see it as an opportunity to begin this quest, which will lead us somewhere. At some point, we do got to get off the quest and get off the fence, as I said, and we have to choose, as Thomas did. And as you said, Thomas had his questions answered, and then Thomas became a missionary, right? He didn't just go on doubting and going nowhere and spinning his wheels. He ended up saying, okay, I see the evidence and I will now believe. There's an aspect of this where if Jesus says, don't unbelieve or don't disbelieve, but believe, that means that there's a choice that needs to be made. It's not just something that happens to you one day. It's a choice that needs to be made. Now, I think that a lot of people do think that's all it is. It's like almost like falling in love, right? Falling in love just means that you have these overwhelming feelings and there's nothing you can do about it, so you must act on them. And some people, I think that belief happens the same way. First of all, I would say that I don't think that that's what love is. As we know, that love is an action, not just a feeling. And you have to choose to love even when you don't have the feelings. So belief is the same way. That's what you do when you believe. You are making a choice to trust and to believe, even when your feelings don't necessarily align with that. That's actually when faith and trust comes into play perhaps the most. What I find really interesting about this is, like I said, everybody can relate to this. Everybody has had doubts. Everybody knows somebody who has expressed doubts. And here's the thing that I found really interesting as I was studying up on this is that there are a lot of people who are atheists. They've done studies on people who are atheists. And those studies show that a lot of atheists really struggle with doubts about if they're right. And I think that sometimes people have this idea, right, that people who believe things, that's not the same as like people who are atheists. They're like convinced because they've looked at the evidence. Well, the fact is that's not the case. It's not the case that they're fully convinced on the one hand. And the other hand is that you don't become an atheist just by looking at evidence, because it is a faith commitment. Let's put it this way. There's not enough evidence out there to disprove God. Right? So it's not like you're making this commitment because you've just looked at the facts. No. You have looked at some things and you've drawn conclusions about them. That's how you end up there. And it's the exact same way that you end up being a Christian. You look at the evidence and then based on that, you make a conclusion of faith. You take a step. And either way, you're exercising faith. Either way, you're exercising a belief. Because there's something that you don't know, and yet you're choosing to trust.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point because, when we're faced with the evidence, we're faced with the knowledge, there is a choice to be made as to what we do with that. And I think that's what, I think is important. I think one of the things that, resonated with me is when Thomas says, "My Lord, my God." Mm-hmm. So Jesus presents the evidence. Here I am. I'm standing in front of you. And people have today, they have the evidence, they have it, and what do they do with it? And when Jesus stands in front of you and says, "Here I am," you need to make a choice. It's a commitment of your life to the evidence that God has presented to you. You have to do something with it. And, and that's the point where people either say, "My Lord, my God," or they say, "I'm just going to follow my own way." And, that's the choice that we are faced with many times, is that it's not necessarily, I'm have to step out in blindness. I'm faced with evidence. God exists.
And to that point, there's actually a good example in the Bible of somebody who was presented with the evidence and didn't deny the evidence and yet chose not to surrender his life. And that would be in the book of Acts with Felix, right? So that Paul stands before this king, and the king, brings him forward, and they hear Paul out. And then he says, Paul, you would almost convince me to be a Christian too. And he says, come on, man, this stuff didn't happen in a corner, is what Paul says to him. This stuff all happened. You know that it happened. And he says at the end of the day, he says, yeah, but I'm still not going to do it. He just ends up walking away. And I think that's what a lot of people do. They come to this point where they know they need to make a decision. But rather than making a decision, they just do nothing, right? So it's this point of it's not that they reject it, it's that they don't take that step. And one of the things that Greg Laurie always says, a famous evangelist, he always says that to not make a decision is a decision. That's a decision. So everybody's making a decision. And I think that's a really important point for people, is that, Thomas, he made his decision. But if he would have just said, "Oh, okay, cool, nice to see you, Jesus," and then left or done something else and not come to that point of saying, "My Lord, my God," that's also a decision. And I think that's an important point for people to recognize.
Yeah, and I think that brings up another thing that we discussed was that, people who are faced with empirical evidence don't usually base their decision on the evidence in front of them, but on other factors surrounding that. It might be some emotional tie. It might be that I don't want to submit myself to God because of what that might mean. I've heard of different people, well, God's going to take this away from me, or he's going to take that away from me. They have these fears or these misconceptions about who God is, and so they back away from the Lord, not based on the fact that he says he is who he says he is, but on other factors, other emotional things.
Yeah, there's a thing in psychology world called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance basically means that we justify our actions. So we want to feel that we're making a good decision. We want to think that we're smart, rational people. And so we do this thing called cognitive dissonance, which means that even if you make a bad decision, you'll somehow, do these gymnastics in your mind to convince yourself that it wasn't really that bad. And people do that cognitive dissonance when it comes to believing in God as well. There's a really, famous saying that I often repeat when we talk about these subjects, and that is that for the majority of people who choose not to follow Jesus, it isn't primarily the empirical evidence. It's something personal. And I've heard that fleshed out so many times. I've had people who say to me, okay, cool, like I've heard this stuff and I don't doubt that it's true, but why are Christians so mean? Or why would God let this thing happen to this person that I love? Or why would God let this other terrible thing happen in the world? And frankly, that's not a new question, because the oldest book in the Bible, the book of Job, probably written prior to the writing of the book of Genesis. Now, it didn't precede the events in the book of Genesis, but it was probably written down prior to it. It's about that question. Here's a guy who does everything right and loves God and worships God, and then some terrible thing happens in his life. And the whole book is trying to sort out the question of why do bad things happen to good people, as we like to say. And so it's not a new question, and it's also not a question that hasn't been answered, but it's a very deeply personal question. And I recently was, in my reading, I was reading about a man who was a pastor, and he was talking about something very difficult to happen in his life. I think it was the death of his wife after many years, decades. And he said that for many years he had never struggled in his faith. And then all of a sudden, when his wife died, he began to struggle. A friend of ours, I remember talking to him, his father died. He was a missionary, and his father died. And he said that for years he really struggled with understanding why God would allow his father to die. But he said that one thing that really helped him was coming to the realization that, wait a second, like, do I think that essentially God owes it to me? I mean, literally every person who's ever lived has died, and they had loved ones. Well, except for a couple, right? There are a few exceptions there. But, why would I go and question that? So for example, a lot of people have died. Why am I not upset that those people died, right? Those people had children, they had fathers, they had mothers, and they died. Why am I upset about this person now? And the reason is because it's personal. And the answer, though, is that Jesus has come because God so loved the world that he sent his son so that whoever believes in him would not perish but have eternal life. He came to get rid of death forever. So he does care, right? He has acted and he has given hope. And so there are answers to the questions. That's my point. And one of the things I really want people to understand is that you don't have to suppress your mental capacity in order to be a follower of Jesus. In fact, God doesn't encourage that. Look at Job. I mean, he's so patient with Job, right? At the end of the day, he kind of puts Job in his place. But you know what? For 30-something chapters, he just lets Job and then his friends go on and talk about this stuff before he gets involved. And what that means is that God isn't suppressing the questions. God doesn't hide Job's questions either, right? Like, he doesn't say, hey, let's pretend that didn't happen. No, he puts out Job's hardest questions and he puts them in a book in his Bible and lets everybody read them, So in other words, God isn't suppressing questions, and neither should we. We should let people be honest about their questions. But if you're really honest about your questions, then be willing to accept a sincere answer when one is provided. That's the other thing I've run into, is that you have people who ask questions, but then when the answer's provided, they're not necessarily willing to accept it. And I think you got to give it to Thomas for that reason, that when he saw the evidence, he said, okay.
Yeah, no, I've done that with quite a few people, actually, that I told them, and I said, I promise you that if you're sincerely looking for an answer to your question, God will answer it. And I've laid down that claim for them and said, you come back to me. If God doesn't answer you, you come back. Or if he does answer you, come back and talk to me. And I've had people come back and tell me God answered their questions legitimately. And God is willing. If you legitimately want an answer to your question, God will answer your questions. I just believe he will. I mean, it might not be the answer you want, but I think if you truly, the Bible says, if you're honestly are seeking his face, he is going to find you and love you and take care of you. I mean, that's what Jesus did. That's salvation through Christ. It's God seeking out man who was at that point not even seeking him, So it's an amazing thing to think about. And just to plug another series, when we're talking about doubt, is that we have a series called I Could Never Believe in a God Who, and we'll link it down in the description. And, there's just a lot of those, maybe you have friends, have a lot of these questions. I could never believe in a God who, hates science, or, all the,
suppresses women,
lets bad things happen to good people. There's a bunch, I think there's 6 in the series. Great way to combat some of these doubts you might have, or maybe you have friends that you have these doubts, and you can present this, send them the link. And just a great way to maybe answer some of the questions that you might have. I'm bringing you to that point to say, my Lord and my God. And that's kind of what we're all about here, is to get people to that place where they see the Lord and they say, my Lord and my God. And so, whitefieldschurch.com, you missed the sermon on Sunday. We look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.